Welcome back to another episode of The Road Chose Me. My name's Dan Grech, and today a topic that I've been kind of dancing around for a while, but now it's time to address it. If you're setting out on a long-term overland expedition, is it better to take an older vehicle that you can repair with baling wire and a hammer, or is it better to take a more modern vehicle? This is an age-old debate, but I have to say, from my experience and what I've learned, you might be surprised with what I recommend. If you want to know all about it, stick around. Let's get into all the details right now. So there's no doubt about it. For many years, the conventional wisdom has been that older vehicles are better when you're driving around the world. And this does make sense. If you're in the middle of the Congo or the salt flats in Bolivia, you're not going to find a diagnostic computer to fix problems with a modern vehicle. And if you've just got a mechanical injection pump, if you don't have any sensors on your wheels for ABS and things like that, first of all, there's less that can go wrong. And second of all, it's going to be easier to fix. And I do believe this is true. Furthermore, when you do limp yourself to a garage in the Congo or wherever you happen to be, chances are they've seen an older Land Cruiser or an older Land Rover. They know what they're looking at. They know how to fix it. They've probably pulled apart a fuel pump before. They might even have one themselves, or someone in town has one. You might be able to buy their fuel pump or buy parts out of it to get yourself back on the road. And in the meantime, they wait for parts. All of these things are definitely true. I believe that older vehicles are easier to fix just because they are simpler. But I do also believe there's a bit of a catch-22 going on there. While they're easier to fix, they also require more fixing. And there's a couple of reasons for this. And one of them is just the simple fact that by now those vehicles are 30 or 40 years old. So they've been through hundreds of thousands of heat cycles. They've driven hundreds of thousands of miles. They're simply old and they're starting to wear out. And that's no fault of the vehicle. It's not because they're bad vehicles. It's just the reality of when you have rubber seals and hose clamps and wiring subjected to the elements for 30 or 40 years, they wear out. It's a simple fact of life. So what I saw on the road is tons of people driving old Land Rovers and old Land Cruisers, and no doubt about it, they were having to replace things like radiators because they were rusting through. They were replacing alternators and starter motors and things like that simply because they were just so old they had worn out. Versus this Wrangler that I drove around Africa, when I set out, it was only 5 years old, and as it sits here right now, it's 10 years old. It has 190,000 miles on it. Not only does it still have the factory radiator, it still has the factory radiator hoses. It still has the factory serpentine belt. Heck, it's still got the factory globes in the tail lights because none of them have ever worn out simply because they're not old enough. So it's a funny catch-22 where older vehicles are easier to repair, but they need more repairing simply because they're old. And the best example I got of this was I bumped into this Aussie couple, Mick and Ed, and I filmed a video about them. They're hilarious. They were driving a Land Rover Defender, I think it was from 1984, and they actually drove the exact same route I did around Africa. So all the way down the West Coast and all the way up the East Coast. But they were half of the trip in front of me. And so it was great to meet up with them and, learn a whole bunch. And at the time, their Land Rover was broken down. And we got to chatting, we became really good friends. And I followed Ed online. And so when he finished his trip, he posted a huge big summary. And it was really interesting to compare to my trip. Ed spent 84 days lying on the ground working on his Defender. That's to do exactly the same trip I did. And I spent less than 10 days. And all of those except one were just oil changes and tire rotations. So right there, you can wonder, would Ed have spent more time enjoying his trip if he'd driven a newer, more reliable vehicle like mine? Or did Ed enjoy lying on the dirt, getting grease on his hands? Maybe he did. That's great. It was really interesting too to see the list of things on Ed's Defender that had worn out. The list is enormous, but when I summarize it, it was the water pump, 2 alternators, 2 clutches. They actually had to rebuild the entire gearbox. And then he quoted and said, countless bushings and suspension pieces. Oh, and wheel bearings and ball joints and tie rod ends and things like that. So Ed replaced all of those as he was going around Africa. And there's no doubt it's impressive that he was able to source all of those things. Chances are I would have had a harder time with my Jeep. But the reality is, because my Jeep has so fewer miles on it and it's just not so old, I just didn't need them. So it's not even really relevant how hard would it be to get wheel bearings for this Jeep, because I just didn't need them because it's just not that old and they're not worn out. So while people on the road, they're replacing radiators and things like that from older vehicles that are starting to have, worn out parts and electrical gremlins, I, on the other hand, I'm just enjoying my trip because a newer vehicle just doesn't have as many problems. Another big thing about older vehicles is they really were designed back in like the 60s and 70s, before we even had computer-aided design, before there was the same kind of extreme testing, and they didn't put vehicles on dynos for tens of thousands of hours to see what would wear out. Whereas a vehicle like this has undergone an enormous amount of computer testing and real-world testing. And I always see that played out in, like, if you look at a vehicle from the 80s, chances are it has needed an engine rebuild or a gearbox rebuild after, let's say, 150,000 miles. Because back then, gearboxes just weren't built with the same tolerances that they are today. It just wasn't possible to machine all the gears and make it all fit together as perfectly as we can today. Same story goes with like all of the rubber seals and all of the oils and all of the lubricants that we use. They've advanced greatly in those 40 years. So when you drive a newer vehicle, all of that stuff has just been designed better simply because it benefits from 40 years of engineering improvements. Besides reliability and ease of repair, I think it's also worth talking about creature comforts. The reality is, when you're on a long-term overland trip, you are going to spend hundreds, maybe even thousands of hours of your life sitting in the cockpit of your vehicle. And obviously you have the window down, you're trying to enjoy the scenery, but at some point it does get arduous and you are kind of stuck in the driver's seat. I don't know about you, but if I'm going to spend thousands of hours in the driver's seat, I'd like it to be comfortable. It's pretty nice to have air conditioning. It's pretty nice to have cruise control on the rare days I can use it. I mean, this Jeep even has heated seats. It has a really nice stereo. And above all of that, it's immensely quieter than some of the old vehicles I rode in. Sometimes when I was in towns, I would jump in the back of another Overlander's Land Cruiser or Land Rover, and we would zip into town. And it always shocked me how much like tractors they were. You pretty much had to yell at the driver while you were sitting in the passenger seat just so that you could hear each other talk. Back in the 80s, sound deadening just wasn't what it is today. And the engines in those vehicles, they just derived from tractors. So like noise, vibration, and handling, which modern vehicles, really focus on, back then it just wasn't so much of a thing. People were just happy they had a vehicle that even could take them to those remote destinations. So for me, at the end of a long driving day, I would get out of the driver's seat of this Jeep and be tired, but not exhausted, versus some other Overlanders. They would almost say like their ears are ringing, they need to sit down, they're exhausted just from driving kind of a rattly older machine. On top of that, not only do we think about reliability and creature comforts, safety is a really big factor when you're driving around the world. I have seen my fair share of suicidal drivers. I thought they were bad in Peru. The drivers in Kenya and Tanzania took that to another level, and then Egypt just blew it out of the water. The way people drive there is just insane. And it's a simple fact that a collision really is a big danger when you're driving through countries like this. And I have met a couple of Overlanders who've been involved in severe, severe crashes. One couple that I met while I was in Ethiopia, they were heading south and I was heading north. I was nearly finished my trip. We hung out for a few days and got to know each other. They continued on their trip, and a couple of months later down in Kenya, they had a head-on collision with a fully loaded truck. And I saw the photos of the aftermath. They were extremely lucky to survive. They had some injuries, but nothing too severe, and they're doing okay these days. But this kind of thing happens. I read another thread where someone down in South America had the same thing happen. Trucks will just overtake on blind corners, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. It doesn't matter how safely you're driving. So for me, it's pretty nice to have a modern vehicle that has ABS, it has traction control and stability control. More than that though, it has airbags and it has a modern crumple zone. And I get it, a big Jeep like this, it's not the same crumple zone as a really well-engineered Mercedes, passenger car. But I feel pretty certain the crumple zone in this is a lot better engineered than it is from a Defender or a Land Cruiser from back in the 80s, when realistically crumple zones and crash safety weren't much of a thought. Especially when you consider that this has front airbags. That's the difference. That's gonna save your life when you're in Chile and the unthinkable happens and a bus tries to overtake on a blind corner and you actually have a head-on collision at speed. So for me, if I'm going to spend years of my life out there, risking these kinds of accidents, it's pretty nice to do it in a vehicle that actually has some safety features that will actually save me in the unlikely event of a major accident. So on the surface, it might seem like driving an older car is a great idea, but actually there's a lot of reasons to go with newer vehicles as well. And the best example of this that I've got for you, once again, I'm going to reference Scott Brady and the team from Expedition 7s. They were setting out to set a world record to be the first vehicles ever to drive on every continent on Earth. So they have access to a lot of vehicles around the world, lots of resources at their disposal, and Scott has an immense amount of experience overlanding. Now, he could have chosen any vehicles in the world, but did he choose old Defenders or old Land Cruisers with mechanical injection pumps and hand crank everything? No, they selected brand new turbo diesel V8 Land Cruisers. These are computer controlled, sophisticated vehicles. They have airbags, they have ABS, they have computer control. So he had access to any vehicle in the world, and that's what he chose to drive around the world. And guess what? On their entire trip, they never had a single vehicle problem, because new modern vehicles are engineered so well and they're tested so rigorously. If you buy one brand new, there's no reason at all to think you'll have a single problem in the first 100,000, probably even the first 200,000 miles. And that's exactly what Scott and the team experienced. So I hope that information's been helpful, and I hope it gets you thinking more about what options you can choose for your long-term overland vehicle. And I want to make it clear, you don't have to import some oddball vehicle from the other side of the world just because in the 80s and 90s it was a really good choice. That's great in the 80s and 90s, but that was a really long time ago. These days we have so many more modern options that are available to us, and they work extremely well. So don't discount them. So if it has been helpful, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and as always, I need to say a big thanks to my supporters on Patreon. I'm now offering vehicle and trip consulting to my supporters on Patreon. So if you're interested in doing a trip around the world and you want to get my input on the route, on the timing, visas, if you've got questions about which vehicle you should take or what modifications you can make, all of those kinds of things, I offer now one-on-one consulting services with my supporters on Patreon. So there's a link down in the description. Check it out. From $5 a month, you can sign up and start getting access to this exclusive content and consulting services about the trip that you're going to make. So thanks again very much for watching, and until next time, stay safe and maybe I'll bump into you on the road.